There's a breach. There's something happened in that relationship that's broken. Heaven and earth, the picture. If you think about it, when we talk about the end of things, the end times, whatever we want to call them, the purpose of that is the creation of a new heaven and a new earth. And the picture that we have is that we'll probably be able to move fairly freely between the two. But here, the relationship between heaven and earth is broken. So that cosmic relationship, if you want to put it that way, has been broken. And then the last one, you'll notice we've got two guys, and what's in the middle? A mouth. This is the Tower of Babel. Human beings can no longer communicate with each other in the same language. The languages have all been split because human beings tried to reach up to be like God. And God said, that's nothing, and cast down the tower. The epistle. Yes. Yeah, the tongue. Exactly. And of course, the symbol of it all being put back together again is the day of Pentecost. Acts chapter 2. That's the sign of the thing to come, where the disciples are on the roof and they're speaking in all these different languages and people understand them. That's the symbol of it all coming back together again. So what we have is this broken creation, God's judgment. Now I want you to notice something else, because this is quite an important picture. Look at each of the pictures of the human beings around the edge, and they've got a red circle around them. What do you know? What do you think that symbolizes? Where did the arrow used to point in the previous picture? To God. Where does it point now? To the self. Human beings have turned in on themselves in this picture and have become self-centered rather than God-centered. And that's an important concept to get hold of. So what we see, if you turn over the page, please, but what we also see in Genesis is this picture. And this picture is an important picture. Notice at the top you've got God, and you've got his creation, and all of that kind of thing. It's Genesis chapter 2. What do you notice about the top right-hand side? What does it say creation is? Good. And we do need to remember that. Creation is good. So often we've treated it as though it's bad. Creation is good. And remember, creation only became damaged by virtue of human action. But in itself, creation is good. So that's important. But now we've got these four little scenarios which we just went through. So notice, at the top, it's the serpent again with Adam and Eve, and it's what Genesis chapter 3, and what usually that's known as is the fall. Yeah? And the judgment, so there's the sin, which is the eating of the tree of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Please don't get mixed up. It is not an apple. Okay? The Bible does not say they ate an apple. The Bible says they ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It does not tell us what it was. It just says, despite what Steve Jobs has done with his Apple logo, it's got nothing to do with an apple. Okay, so they eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and what does that bring? It brings judgment, which leads to death. Death. But there is a grace. And the grace is that God doesn't leave the man and the woman naked, but he gives them clothing. That's the grace. Did they get out and walk? Did they deserve that? No. It's a grace. And a grace is a free gift of God. Some people who might be as ancient as I am might have been taught this at Sunday school. Grace. Anyone know what? Was anyone taught what the GRACE actually stand for?
God's righteousness at Christ's expense.
Exactly right. God's righteousness or riches at Christ's expense. That's what grace stands for. God's riches or righteousness at Christ's expense. So a grace is a free gift. I'm glad you were taught in a good Sunday school. That's good. Sorry?
I picked that up along
You picked that up along the way. Okay. So notice the next sin is the Cain and Abel sin. And the sin is murder. The judgment is expulsion. You've got to go and walk the earth on your own. You'll always be a wanderer. But notice what the grace is. The mark of Cain. The sign to protect him. So although God expels him, again, he doesn't leave him without something. Does Cain deserve that? No. But he gets it. And then if we notice the next thing, the sin of the sons of God and the daughters of men are cosmic confusion. The judgment is, what's the flood? The grace is Noah. Noah. I wish I'd never made these people, God says. And even Noah, if you think about it, I mean, does Noah do anything to deserve being given the job of building the ark and floating around in it? No. Not as far as we. He's a godly man. But what does he do is pretty much as soon as he pitches up on the mountain, he gets drunk. I mean, goes into the vineyard and gets drunk and is lying naked before his sons. I mean, Noah's not exactly a reputable character. And then, if we come down a little bit further, the sin is the Tower of Babel. You'll notice that tower is a particular shape. And it follows the design of something called a ziggurat, believe it or not. And a ziggurat was the Babylonian version of a pyramid. Okay? So when we see that sign throughout Scripture, it usually relates to the Babylonians. And of course, Babylonian, Tower of Babel, there's all kinds of links there, yeah? So what happens is the judgment is dispersal. The people are spread across the earth. What's the grace? Abraham. Genesis chapter 12. Yeah? Now again, Abraham does nothing to deserve this job of being the father of a nation and the blesser of the earth. Does nothing. It tells us that he actually worshipped foreign gods. He worshipped idols. There's absolutely no reason why God should go, okay, Abraham, because you're a really special guy, I'm going to give you this job and I'm going to let you do this. There's no reason. God, for some reason, out of his grace, chooses Abraham, or Abram as he was then, to do this task, to be the father of a nation. But it's all based around grace and not works. So often what we tend to think is the Old Testament is based around works, what you can do for God, and the New Testament is based around grace, what God does for us. But both Testaments are actually based around grace. What God did for humanity. Yes.
And this looking at it kind of reinforces it.
Yeah.
It's like a remnant.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. God never gives up on us. He never gives up on us. There's always that act of grace. There's always the possibility of grace. Now, of course, there's also the possibility of refusing the grace. Adam and Eve could have turned around to God and said, thanks, we don't want this. Cain could have said, don't you do that. I'm sick and tired of you, God. You kicked me out the garden. Don't you mark me. I don't need you. Noah could have said, don't be so ridiculous. I'm not going to build an ark.
Noah's obedience.
Yeah.
Noah's obedience, Abraham's obedience.
Exactly. Exactly. And Abraham could have said, well, go find another guy. Yeah? And they wouldn't have received the grace. I mean, God would have worked his purpose out in another way. The story would change. But they wouldn't have received the grace. And it's exactly the same with the effect of the death of Christ, if you think about it. We can either receive it or not. You know, I mean, I could say to Cecil, I could say, Cecil, I've got a gift for you round at my house. You'll want to come and get it. Because it's a good gift, Cecil. I mean, you don't deserve it, but, you know, it's a good gift. And you never show up. Do you ever get the gift?
No, you missed a career.
Exactly, yeah? You never get the gift. So when God offers something out of grace, we also have to receive it. We also have to receive it. And so we also have, you know, so we're offered eternal life through the death of Christ on the cross. We have to receive it.
But we have to open it.
Exactly.
Open that.
Yeah.
How do we know?
Yeah. Some people just receive it. And they say, I'm great, I've got blood on my ticket, I'm not going to do anything else. But actually opening the gift means that then we discover God's purpose for our life. And how we go back to that original picture of service for God.
Not to destroy anything, but back here just a few minutes ago, you said there was no reason.
There's no reason.
No reason to human understanding, but there was a reason that God did this.
Yeah. There's no reason why they should have received it, but other than that God decided. That's the grace. God decides, this is the offer I'm making you. Will you receive it or not? That's what makes it a gift. That's what makes it grace. Exactly. Yeah. That's what makes it grace. That's what makes it. I mean, gift and grace in the Greek have the same root. Charismata, charism. It just means gift. So when we talk about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the Greek word is charism. The same as this word in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, when he talks about grace and gift, it's charism. It's the same Greek. It's the same Greek. Hebrew's different, but it's the same Greek. So there's a covenant made. If you turn over the page, we won't spend too much time on this. But there is a covenant made. And then we'll take a break. And the covenant is symbolized. We'll come to these two funny looking people later on. But there's Abraham on the one side and God on the other side. And what happens is Abraham's told to kind of prepare a runway of heifers and stuff and cut them in half. And God passes down the middle with this staff and these burning coals. And it's God making the agreement. And the agreement you can see at the bottom. I will make you a great nation. The map of Israel. I will make you the father of many children, basically, is what he says. And Abraham's going, yeah, right. That's possible. I'm 90. And so is Sarah. How's this going to happen?
It happened. I have a little story about that. I'll tell you later.
Okay, you tell me later, Christine. You haven't got something to tell me, have you? And notice the third thing, that this nation at the top is now put at the bottom, and notice the cup is tipping with the wine coming out of it, because what does it say? It says that this nation, that this Abrahamic nation, is going to be a blessing to all nations. Now, actually, the translation is not the best. There are three possible translations to what it says in the Hebrew around, let's go back to Genesis 12 for a sec, just so that you can see this. If we go back to Genesis chapter 12, in my translation it says this: and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. That's what it says in mine. Anybody got families? Right. That's the best translation. Okay, if you were actually wanting to say which is the best, it's all the families of the earth. Second best, all the peoples of the earth. Third best, all the nations. Now, just look at the difference there. The nations is sort of a vague concept, yeah? Peoples, yeah, okay, but families, that's really close. All the families of the earth will be blessed through Abraham. All the families of the earth will be blessed through Abraham. That's really a vital thing to understand. So what's the purpose of the Jewish people? According to this, what's their purpose? If this was their mission statement, to use a modern phrase, God's mission statement for his people, what's their main purpose? To be a blessing to the families of the earth. Now, if we went back to the book of Romans and around about chapters 6 and 7, what we discover Paul saying is to the Christians in Rome who are arguing with each other about who should be in charge, the Romans or the Greeks, the Gentiles or the Jews. That's what Romans is about. Who should be in charge of the church? Ever had that happen before? An argument about who should be in charge of the church? And St. Paul is dealing with the Greeks and the Jews arguing with each other. And what he says was, guys, we are all children of Abraham. Just because the Greeks think they've now, Jesus has done something for them, well, yeah, he has, but he still links them back to Abraham. And just because the Jews think they've been around for a long time and so therefore should be better than the Gentile people, they're children of Abraham too. And what are the children of Abraham supposed to do? They're to be a blessing to the families of the earth. Does that give us a clue as to what we're supposed to be about as Christians? We're supposed to be a blessing to the families of the earth. It would be good to start with the families who live in our parish. Might be a good place to start. You know, families of the earth. A little bit out there. But this whole idea of blessing is crucial.
But you can be a blessing to those families only if they accept the fact.
Yeah.
And that's the same way with us and Jesus. If we accept the fact, then Jesus will be a blessing to us, and we will be a blessing to him. But they'll turn their back on you when you're trying to help them.
Yeah, but God never turns his back on us, and we should never turn our back on them either. So even if we're rejected, the graciousness is to continue to try to be a blessing. Because we never know when that door's going to open. And that's the key. God never stops seeking to be a blessing to us. God never stops seeking to bless us. God never gives up on those who say, I don't want to know. It's interesting, for example, if we take a good example, and I'll finish this section with this, C.S. Lewis. Now, C.S. Lewis was brought up as an Anglican, became an atheist, then ultimately became what we would call a deist, which is he believed in God, but he didn't see the point of Jesus. And then he became a Christian. And C.S. Lewis illustrated his life like this. He said, there's a difference, and I'll just give you the phrase he used, and then I'll give you his illustration. He says there's a difference between nearness and approach. And this is what he meant. This is how he illustrated it. He said, imagine that you're on a mountain, and you're walking around the mountain to come down to your house. And you may have to walk around that mountain 3 times to follow the path, because it's too dangerous to go. So you walk around and your house is over here, but you're only on the second path. So you look down and you could actually take a rock and toss it into your backyard. But you've actually got to go all the way around the mountain again to be able to come in. So he says, I could be near, but my approach has to be to go around the mountain again. And that's the way it is with a lot of us when we're receiving or not receiving the blessings of God or the blessing of others. We can be near. The blessing can be offered. For Lewis, the sanctuary of the house is right there. He can toss a rock. But he has to go all the way around the mountain to actually get to it. He has to take another hard road. So near but yet so far. But that doesn't mean the sanctuary of the house disappears. It's still on offer. But he has to go around the mountain to get there. Make sense? We'll take a break for, let's come back at 11 o'clock, okay? Okay, so if you could turn over to the next page. So what I've been doing is building the kind of foundation that looks at the story and gets us to the Jews being in Egypt. Now, we've missed out a whole lot of stuff, of course. People like Jacob, Reuben was the eldest of the children of Israel, with Issachar and Levi the next in line. That whole bit, we've missed that. But what happens, of course, at the end of the book of Genesis is that the Jews end up where? In Egypt. And how long do they stay in Egypt?
500 years.
You're close, Lawrence. 400. 400 years. So they stay in Egypt for 400 years. And you'll notice from the illustration that we've got there, of course, Pharaoh is up there in the sort of top right-hand corner. Yeah, you can see his face. And you'll notice something. Who is smacking him in the eye? God. So one of the most important things to recognize about this whole story is, and it begins in Genesis, but it's particularly so in the history of the Jews, and it's there all the time, right the way through the Old Testament. There's this constant battle between God and some sort of earthly imperial ruler. Now, in this case, it's God against Pharaoh. And it's set up in that way, that it's like a battle between the God and Pharaoh. Remember, Pharaoh's supposed to be a god anyway. And so it's set up in this way. And it's who's the strongest, ultimately. And of course, God wins all the time, so he should. He's God. But it's this battle, and some people would even say that the New Testament is a battle between God and the Roman Empire, or maybe God and the Jewish Empire. And some people would even go as far as to say that even today, the church finds itself often over and against the government. If, that there's or as St. Paul calls it, the powers and principalities of this present age. There's often a conflict between those sets of values. And so this here is, in very simple illustration, the story of the Exodus. Now, so it's said in terms of being a battle between Moses and Pharaoh. Now, if you look on the left-hand side, you'll notice there that there is a circle of chains, yes? So the Jews in Egypt are what? If we slaves or captives, yeah? And they're captive in Egypt. What then happens is that they leave. Now notice all those things that look like fingernail clippings, just next to the circle of chains. That's actually the crossing of the Red Sea. Okay? So they cross the Red Sea. And they then move out. Now you'll notice there are these two weird-looking characters there, a male and a female. They're foreign gods. We'll come back to them quite a few times. And we'll come back to them in particular later on. And also you'll notice there's the serpent and the stick, so there's miracles that happen. So when the Jews are out in the wilderness, they worship foreign gods. What's the biggest example of them worshipping a foreign god? The calf, the golden calf, yeah? That's the biggest example, which is a very funny story if you read it, because Aaron goes, well, there it was. It suddenly jumped out of the fire, and it's nothing to do with us, nothing to do with me. I mean, I didn't do anything. It's a very funny story. But anyway, so there's the worship of foreign gods, but also God does miraculous signs, like the serpent and the staff. Like, what other miraculous sign? What's the biggest miraculous sign God does? Water out the rock, but that's not. The angel, yeah, that could be. Actually, the manna and the quail. Because that's on a daily basis. A miracle on a daily basis. So there's all kinds of miraculous things that happen. Now, if we get to the bottom, this is, I mean, nobody really knows where Mount Sinai is. There's at least 5 different possibilities. But nonetheless, this is symbolic of the gathering at Mount Sinai. And you'll notice there's a cloud and lightning to symbolize that God is there. And what else do you notice about that picture? What else is in the picture? Well, there's the tabernacle down at the bottom for worship. Anything else in the picture?
Is that a door that you're getting to?
No. The commandments. The commandments. It's also you'll notice there's 5 dots around the commandments, the 5 history books, the Pentateuch. All of that is there. And so you'll notice there's God, there's worship going on. But what do you think those bald guys are standing, or those little circles around it are? It's a view from the top. It's the top of people's heads. It's the people of God gathered together, worshipping. If you think about it, it takes us back to that original image of when the men and the women were all standing around creation with God above them. Yeah? That original picture that we had way back when. The Jews are supposed to be a worshipping people gathered around their God and working with their God and obeying His law. That's the picture.
So in that, we're looking through God's eyes on this.
If you like, yeah. On looking down on the top of a bunch of bald people, actually, if you look at. So that's the picture there. How long do they spend in the wilderness? 40 years. And they spend it in the wilderness because they didn't trust God to take them to their destination. And who has to die before they're allowed into their destination? The whole of the generation that started out, with the exception of Caleb and Joshua. Because Caleb and Joshua went into the land with the other guys, and the other guys came back and said, there's giants, we can't possibly do this, and Caleb and Joshua said, we can take the land. So Caleb and Joshua are allowed to survive. Everybody else has to die out before they're allowed into the land. So you've got this arrow with a sort of roaming around piece. Then if you notice, you go up and there's another arrow, and there's those funny looking fingernail clippings things again. Because where did they cross? They crossed the Jordan. Okay? Now there's a difference between when they crossed the Jordan and when they crossed the Red Sea. When they crossed the Red Sea, it just opened. When they crossed the Jordan, what do they have to do? No, maybe afterwards, but before, just to cross. The priests carry the ark, exactly. And the river doesn't open until the priest's feet hit the river. It's an act of faith. I saw a cartoon not too long ago about the crossing of the Red Sea. It has all the water stacked up on either side and this little track through the middle. And Moses and a few of the boys are standing on the Egyptian side. And Moses looks at this guy who's obviously been talking to him and says, "What do you mean it's muddy?" Typical of the Israelites. They then go into the land and they kind of take the land, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, turn over the page. This is where our friends the Hittites come in. This is the covenant. Now, the covenant is not the Ten Commandments. Okay? It's more than the Ten Commandments. The covenant, we tend to think that the covenant between God and his people is the Ten Commandments. It's actually more than, because it includes things like don't eat shellfish, don't eat pork, and all of those kind of things. So there's a lot more to the covenant relationship. But the Ten Commandments are the big deal. The Ten Commandments are the big deal. So you'll notice that God has something to do with this. And it's actually the obedience to the law. If you look at the first little guy on the left-hand side, what's he doing? Worshiping. So what do you think that says about obedience to the law? That we give thanks. Obedience to the law is actually an act of worship, not an act of duty. No, thank you, Pat. Not an act of duty. It's an act of worship. Now you'll notice the other guy's got his hands on his hips because, of course, he's not feeling very worshipful. Yeah? But what the Jews kind of failed to understand throughout history was that the law was about worship, not about duty. And ultimately we come down to people like the Pharisees, for whom it's more about duty than it is about worship. And so that's a key thing. Now, if we look at, if you turn to Exodus 20 for a minute. This is the Ten Commandments, which is, as I say, at the center of the law. And they come under number 3. But if we were to follow this all the way through, we would find that a particular pattern emerges in the way in which this law is set out. And it's actually typical of legal covenants that were set up in what they call the ancient Near East, in other words, the area where all this takes place. And the reason that we discovered this was because of the Hittites. When they found all this stuff around the Hittites in the mountains of Turkey, what they discovered was a whole bunch of covenants. And they all follow this pattern. And they've subsequently realized, and they found other covenants between people and individuals. You know, if I were to have an agreement with Christine, I might make it a covenant. We might covenant to do whatever. So they found all kinds of examples of covenant they first of all amongst the Hittites, but later on they realized, oh, these all have the same pattern, and hang on a minute, they have the same pattern as the biblical covenant. And the biblical covenant goes like this. God, first of all, tells you who he is. I am God. And that's the way in which it would have been in a covenant relationship. The person with whom you're making the covenant tells you who they are. I am the king, blah, 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 blah. So that's phase one. Phase two is then the history. This is what either we've done together, or this is what I've done for you, and we're making this agreement because of that. So this is who I am, this is our history together, and God does that. You know, I brought you out of Egypt, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And you can see the illustration there. Notice the pyramid in the middle is the symbol for Egypt. And then we come to the heart of it. This is the agreement. Exodus 20, particularly 3 to 17. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, the land of slavery, all that stuff's there. You shall have no other gods before me, and so on and so forth. And then, remember, verse 8, remember the Sabbath days and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath. These are what's called the stipulations. In other words, this is at the heart of the covenant. You've got to do this. This is the basis of the agreement. You've got to do this. This is the covenant. And then there's an order that comes next. And basically what they're told to do elsewhere is that they're told that they've got to read the covenant. They have to remind themselves of the covenant. It has to be read on a regular basis. You can't just throw it in because you need to be reminded. And if you notice throughout the Bible, often in the Psalms and places like that, there's a repetition of God brought us out of Egypt. The covenant's often repeated, or parts of it are often repeated in the worship. In a sense, it's a little bit like the creed. You know, the creed says, this is what we're about here, guys. And we repeat it every week in order to remind us. This is what it is. You know, you don't want to be losing this. And then, ancient covenants always had witnesses. But of course the problem, and they were usually the gods. The problem is, God is God. So this covenant, as we read the text, is actually, it's witnessed, as it were, by the whole of creation. God says, this is the deal, the whole of creation, look at this is our deal. This is what we're going to do. And then, there's the consequences of keeping the covenant or breaking the covenant. And the consequences are this. If you keep the covenant, you will be blessed. And you will live long in the land that I have promised you. But if you break the covenant, you will be cursed. And the land will be taken from you. So, you know, it's the same as if Lawrence and my covenant, we've agreed, Lawrence is going to borrow $1,000 from me. And the deal is, that'll be a great blessing to you as long as you pay it back to me. But if you don't pay it back, I'm going to be sending some boys with baseball bats round to your house to sort you out, Lawrence. Yeah? It's a blessing. But if you don't keep with it, it's a curse. Yeah? So that's the shape of the covenant. If you read through it, that's the shape of it. Starts off with God, the history, the stipulations, the need for repetition, the witnesses, and the consequences. And that's the shape, and that's how many, many covenants were written in those days. And it's a two-way street here. Basically, with the Abraham covenant, God just says, this is what I'm going to do. Really, Abraham didn't have to do very much except go. This covenant's a different covenant. This is what I'm going to do for you, but this is what you're going to do for me. It's a different covenant. It's an attempt to make the Jews fly right, actually, is what it is. So that they can be the people who will show how to live in a good relationship with God, so that other nations will be wanting to participate in that. Yes, Fran.
The law, the Ten Commandments, the law,
Yes.
isn't the expectation that our people would do more than obey the
Oh, yes.
law, that they would internalize it,
Mm-hmm.
and their behavior would come from the wisdom of God
Yep.
that God brings, and that same is expected in the new commandment that Jesus gives.
That we love one another, yes. No, exactly. And that's why it's set in the context of worship, not in the context of duty. If we're doing it, if they're doing it out of duty, as they eventually do, it just becomes a grind. If they're doing it out of worship, it actually changes their character. And that's why it's set in that context of worship. It's an act of worship to do these things. Why? What's the worship about? God first loved us, and so we respond in loving worship to him. That's the picture. God first loved, so we love.
And the church has sort of missed that.
Yeah.
Because I was taught, when I was taught the Ten Commandments, I was taught the first 4 commandments are about our duty to God, and the last 6 are about our duty to our neighbor. So we were taught the commandments were a duty
Yes.
and not an act of worship.
Not an act of worship, exactly. I mean, we've missed it as much as the Jews. We're as good at being Pharisees as the Jews are. I mean, I'm a very good Pharisee. I was telling Cecil a story earlier on about my Pharisaic nature, where at Stone Church, because we had a lot of people who had an alcohol issue, we used to use grape juice for some, if you wanted it, rather than communion wine, because you could go on a bender if you got into the communion wine. And someone came to me and they said, "You shouldn't be doing that. It says in the Book of Common Prayer, it has to be fermented grape juice." I said, okay. So I went to the Chancel Guild ladies and I said, "Okay, ladies, this is what you're going to do. On a Saturday night when you set up, I want you to crack the grape juice and leave it open to the air. Then it's fermented by Sunday morning. Not much. I can be as big a Pharisee as anybody else." It's dead easy to be a Pharisee. It's dead easy to follow the rules out of duty and not out of love.
Well, you almost started that mafia there a minute ago.
Exactly, you know. Okay, if you turn over the page. So this is the picture. Really, it's basically because they were enslaved, God acted, and therefore they were to be a worshipping community. Because we are enslaved in sin, this is just a pointing us in a future direction. Because we're enslaved in sin, the servant king comes and dies on a cross and is raised to life. Therefore, we are able to worship.
So therefore, on the bottom, they come together.
They come together. As a worshipping servant people, though, notice. And that's what we're supposed to be, and that's what they're supposed to be. God wants us to serve him and to serve each other. That's his purpose. So if you turn over the page, we'll now look at the conquest, but we'll look at this fairly quickly. There were some things that... So the Jews come in, approximately where that is. Now you'll notice there are 3, if you follow the line up the Red Sea, the River Jordan, sorry, up, you'll notice there are three pieces of water, three blue things, pretty much in the middle of the page. The top one is called Lake Huleh, H-U-L-E-H. What's the next one? The Sea of Galilee. And the next one? The Dead Sea. So those are the three pieces of water that basically still exist in Israel today. What happens is that they come in with the Ark of the Covenant and also with the sword. And they begin to establish themselves all over the territory. But notice that they go both north and south. And of course what we have here is the Battle of Jericho. You can see that there's Jericho there. And also various other key places here. Shiloh is not the ranch off the High Chaparral in this case. Okay? For anybody who remembers. Shiloh is a place of worship. It's the place where they worshipped before they worshipped in Jerusalem. Okay? Now if you go to Shiloh, I've never been to the Holy Land, but I'm told. If you go to Shiloh today, what you will find is, you'll still find Eli's house. The base, the foundation of Eli's house, because this is where Eli was and when Samuel and the temple and all that stuff, or not the temple, the shrine. This is that, Shiloh is that place. And apparently if you go to Shiloh today, it's like a natural amphitheater, and in the bottom is where they used to gather, they used to worship. But all the way around the hills, what they've discovered is as they've dug into the grass, they've discovered black spots all over the hills. Little black spots. Well, about yay big. Maybe as wide as this table. Anybody guess what they were? Not sacrifice, that would have happened in the bottom. They're actually fires. It's where the people gathered when they came to the shrine for a festival. They would gather and camp in the amphitheater, and it's where they set a fire to keep warm. And even to this day, those marks are still there. So just an interesting aside. No, got nothing much to do with anything I'm talking about. But now notice the other come down from up from Shiloh, Mount Gerizim. That's important. That's what the Samaritan woman talks about when she said, "You worship on one mountain and we worship on another." It's Mount Gerizim. Is that mountain, and of course Jerusalem is the mountain that the Jews worship on. So there are lots of interesting things here, but I'm going to ask you to turn over the page because this is crucial to a couple of things. Now, you'll notice we've got our two friends who keep popping up all over the place, yes? They're actually two statues of fertility gods, or god and goddess, to be accurate. And you'll notice that if you look very carefully, our little friend on the right-hand side, or left-hand side, has a very large male component, if you look carefully. And also, the woman on the other side has large breasts. And these were actually dug up in the land that we know as ancient Israel. And these are ancient fertility symbols of the pre-Jewish period. Okay? Now the technique is important here because this is how the Jews become what's known as synchronistic. In other words, they don't only worship the one true God, they worship these others as well. And this is what happens. When the Jews were in Egypt, what was their main farming product? Anyone know? Sorry? No, not in Egypt. Sheep. They're sheep farmers. They live in the land of Goshen, and they're sheep farmers. And the song tells us, Jacob and sons spent all of their days in fields with sheep. They're sheep farmers. Okay? Now they then come into this land here, which is not prime sheep farming territory, it's actually arable farming, grain and all that good stuff. So you wouldn't want to be using that good land for sheep. But there's a problem. They're sheep farmers. They don't know how this all works. I'm sure Ralph would have a problem if he was to become a sheep farmer, wouldn't he, Lawrence? You know, he wouldn't really know how it worked, yeah? Well, this is the opposite way. It's like Ralph having done sheep farming all his life and suddenly he's got to grow potatoes. How does it work? So who would you go to ask, how do we do this? How do we do this new type of farming? Who would you go to? The people who know how to do it, who already live there. Well, this is a problem because we're living in a pre-scientific age. So today we'd explain blah, blah, blah. In those days, this is what they believed. There was a male and a female god. And if you look at any of these cults, of the pre-Jewish cults, they all have a male and a female god. And post-Jewish cults as well. And one represents the heavens, usually the male, and the female represents the earth. And so what the belief system was this, that you made an offering to the gods, and the gods would then have sex, and the seed of the male god would be transmitted into the female god and produce the crop. And that seed looks like what we would call, and we had a lot of it yesterday, what? Rain. So that's the way it works. So you have to worship these gods, give them an offering, and they will then get their act together, and the land will be fertilized, and your crops will grow. That's the picture. Now they do add a little bit, they add a twist. And that is that they think, these pre-Jewish people, that the gods in bad years forget to have sex. So they need a bit of a reminder. And that's where we get the idea of temple prostitutes from. Because the farmer would go to the temple and make his offering and then have sex with a prostitute in order to remind the gods what they were supposed to be doing. That's the way that it worked. But of course, God, Yahweh, the God of the Jews, says, leave it to me, you don't need to do all this stuff. But the Jews follow the advice, often, of the locals and get involved in all this worship and synchronicity. So you'll find that throughout this part of the Old Testament, what happens is the Jews are constantly kind of flip-flopping backwards and forwards between worshipping foreign gods and worshipping Yahweh, or they're sort of half and half. Yeah? They still go to the temple or the shrine or whatever and do their thing, but they also do stuff over here as well, just to kind of hedge their bets. So if you look at the illustration that you've got here, God and the law tend to get left out, and the fertility stuff tends to be brought in. And that's part of why God so often at times said, get rid of the people who are already in the land, so that you didn't actually fall into that synchronicity. It sounds harsh to our ears, but that's part of what sits behind it. Because remember what did he say? You shall have no other gods but me. If you turn over the page, so what we then have is Israel takes over the land, but we have this... So you can see there that there are all the different tribes. Notice that there are still some people left in the land. They don't clear the land altogether. Notice at the very bottom there, coming up from the left-hand side, who have we got there other than Jews? Philistines. And they're going to keep popping up in the story, yeah? Then if you come up at the top, there, you can see Dan, the little yellow sort of triangular piece, but who's next to Dan? The Canaanites. They're also still in the land. And then also, if you look at the bottom towards the left-hand side, right-hand side rather, just below Reuben, you've got an arrow going up there. Who are they? Moabites. And then also you've got Ammonites and Amalekites as well. So what we have to understand is they don't clear the land. They come into the land, but they're dwelling in amongst these other people. And that is part of the problem. That's part of the problem. But also notice something else. And this will just take us back to the entry into the land. Notice there are tribes on both sides of the River Jordan. Yeah? So on the right-hand side, you've got Reuben and Gad and all that lot. And then on the left-hand side, you've got Simeon, Judah, Benjamin, Dan, Ephraim, and all that lot. You've even got a bit of Dan on the other side too. When the Jews arrive, the land that they have to, the early part of the conquest is easy. That on the right-hand side, they conquer the land relatively easily. And then those tribes who have been assigned land on that side say, well, thanks very much, guys. See ya. We're all happy here. The rest of you tribes, you've got to go off and conquer on the other side of the river. And God says, no, you're one nation, you all have to go. Even though you've got your land, you've still got to go and help the others on the other side of the river. So this one nation thing is important. We'll come back to it. But it's one nation. But the problem is, of course, the Jews are fragmented now. They've kind of developed a tribal system. And what happens is our pattern again begins to emerge of the Jews sin, they get battered by something, they cry out to God for help, and then they're delivered. And that's the story throughout the book of Judges. They sin, they do something then happens that batters them, like the Philistines come along and beat them up. They cry out to God, and God delivers them by sending them a judge. Someone like Deborah or Samson or Gideon, those kind of people. And so this pattern emerges of unbelief and belief. They sin, they're battered, they cry, and then they're delivered. Which is the same thing as I showed you earlier on, yeah? They're blessed, they sin, they ask for help, they're restored. And that pattern happens all the way through the book of Judges. If you turn over the page, please. And then this is something you don't have, but just to show you. So we have apostasy, the people sin. We have a battering, the Lord disciplines his people somehow. They cry out, and the Lord rescues them. That's the pattern. Okay. And so Judges suggest that Israel has to do three things. Number one, they should be united, not separate. Got to be united, one nation. Number two, Judges also begins to hint that there should be a king, which of course back in the law in Exodus they were told no king. And number three, they've got to maintain the purity of the faith, not worship foreign gods like the Baals. And so we have a king. Now, remember back to the original picture. Who is the king? God. God is the king. They are supposed to be one nation under a king, Yahweh, God, Jehovah, whatever you want to call him. I am. They're supposed to be one nation under one king. But it isn't working. And so the question becomes, let us have a king. But God says, well, guys, if you have a king, remember the last time you were under a king? Who was the last king they were under? Pharaoh. And what did Pharaoh do? Enslave them. If you're going to have a king, you're likely to end up as slaves. You don't want a king. But we want to be exactly the same as the other people around us. And they've got kings. So why can't we have a king? We need a king. That's the way the dialogue kind of goes. And what happens is, ultimately, they get a king. Who's their first king? Saul. King Saul. Anointed by Samuel. So he's anointed by Samuel. And the reason that he is able, what happens at his anointing, we're told, is the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. And it's interesting that we have this interesting picture throughout this period of time where the Spirit of the Lord, or as he's called in the New Testament, the Holy Spirit, comes upon people for purposes. So the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samuel or Gideon or Deborah or Barak as in order to fit them for a purpose. Not everyone in the nation has the Spirit of the Lord upon them. Only those who are fitted for purpose. And here we have the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Saul to make him king. But of course it doesn't work out very well. And so who comes next? David. And so the Spirit of the Lord comes upon David, and Saul ends up being beheaded and his bits hung up on the gates, and David goes and sends people to go and get them down. So if you turn over the page, and we'll have lunch after this, we now come to David. And David is the key king in Israel. David is the one that everybody looks back to. Now remember what I said right back at the beginning. Right back at the beginning I said, during times of peace, what happens in Israel? They profit. And it's a time of peace. If you read the backstory in the book of Kings, it says there is a time of peace. It's not necessarily peaceful in Israel, but the empires aren't fighting each other. And so we have this time of peace. And so therefore what happens is that because there's a time of peace, Israel not only makes a pack of money, but is also able to expand its borders. Because the empires, Egypt and whoever happens to be about then, which is probably the Assyrians, they're weak. And so they're not taking much notice of what's happening in Israel because they're too busy looking after what's happening back home. And so therefore, the Jews are able to expand their territory. So if you look at the map, you can see it's quite a big territory. That's actually the biggest that the territory ever gets in the biblical era. It's not much different to what it is today, actually. But in the biblical era, that's the biggest that the territory ever gets. And this happens under David. David is set up as a great hero, but of course he's also pretty brutal. I mean, David, yes, he's the psalmist and he's all those things, but he's also going to get his way. I mean, just think about what's probably the most brutal thing that he does. Right. Uriah the Hittite. Yes, there's the Hittites again. Uriah the Hittite is sent into the heart of the battle because David has managed to get his wife Bathsheba pregnant, when actually where David should have been was at war. It says it is the spring of the year, when kings go to war. But David stays at home. He should have been there with the army, not sitting around on his roof watching naked women having a bath. He should have been with the boys out in the field. But he's not.
Can't blame him for that.
And so consequently, he's determined that when he makes Bathsheba pregnant, first of all, what does he do? He sends for Uriah and says, come back, and go and sleep with Bathsheba.